We found something in the DNA of ancient Sumerians that rewrites everything we thought we knew about the world's first civilization. And what makes this discovery genuinely unsettling is how long the evidence has been sitting in laboratory databases while nobody connected the pieces. For over a century, the story has been simple enough that it fit neatly into textbooks. The Sumerians appeared in southern Mesopotamia around 4500 BCE, built the first cities, invented writing, developed mathematics, and gave us the foundation of what we call civilization. Where they came from before that remained unclear, but the assumption was always that they migrated from somewhere else. A population arriving in the fertile river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates, settling down and building something unprecedented. That narrative just collapsed. In 2016, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History extracted DNA from Sumerian skeletal remains excavated from multiple sites across southern Iraq. The samples dated from the early dynastic period through the Akkadian Empire, roughly 2900 to 2000 BCE. Standard protocol for ancient DNA analysis. Extract, sequence, compare against existing databases of ancient and modern populations, map the genetic relationships, figure out where people came from and how they moved. What came back made no sense according to the migration model. The Sumerian genome showed almost no evidence of recent arrival from anywhere, no genetic signature pointing to the Iranian plateau, no markers suggesting movement from Anatolia or the Caucasus, no indication of a population sweeping in from Central Asia. Instead, what the data revealed was deep continuity with earlier Mesopotamian populations, stretching back thousands of years before the first cities were built. They were not migrants who arrived and became Sumerian. They were already there. Here is where it gets strange in a way that demands attention. When researchers compared Sumerian DNA to the Ubaid culture, the pre-Sumerian civilization that occupied the same geography from roughly 5,500 to 4,000 BCE, the genetic overlap was substantial. Not distant cousins, not separate populations that happened to occupy the same space at different times. The Sumerians and the Ubaid people were genetically continuous. That creates a problem, a significant one. The Ubaid period shows none of the hallmarks we associate with Sumerian civilization. No writing, no complex mathematics, no large-scale urban planning. And then suddenly, without a clear transitional phase, all of it appears at once. Cuneiform script fully formed. Astronomical knowledge requiring centuries of careful observation, architectural techniques sophisticated enough to build ziggurats, legal codes detailed enough to govern complex societies. If the Sumerians did not arrive from somewhere else carrying that knowledge, where did it come from? The genetic data gets more specific. Analysis of mitochondrial DNA, which traces maternal lineages, shows remarkable stability across the region for over 3,000 years. Populations in southern Mesopotamia during the Ubaid period, the Uruk period, and the early dynastic Sumerian period share maternal ancestry at rates that rule out any significant population replacement. The people were the same people. The culture transformed, but the biology did not. Paternal lineages tell a similar story. Y chromosome analysis shows continuity of male lineages across the same time span, with only minor influx from neighboring regions. Nothing approaching the genetic signature you would expect from an invading or migrating population arriving and establishing dominance. What you are looking at is a civilization that erupted from a population already in place. Not brought by newcomers, not imported through conquest or migration. Indigenous development on a scale and at a speed that does not fit comfortably into conventional models of how civilizations form. The linguistic evidence only deepens the mystery. Sumerian is a language isolate. It has no known relatives anywhere on Earth, not in the Semitic family that includes Akkadian and Hebrew, not in Indo-European, not in any language family that linguists have identified. It stands completely alone. and it appears in the written record already complex, already capable of expressing abstract concepts, already fully functional as a vehicle for literature, law, and administration. Languages do not develop in isolation and then suddenly appear in written form without a long oral tradition behind them. But if Sumerian had that oral tradition, where is the archaeological evidence of the culture that was speaking it before writing was invented? The genetic continuity suggests they were speaking it for thousands of years in the same location. But the material culture from the pre-literate period shows no indication of the social complexity that the later Sumerian language could express. Something happened in southern Mesopotamia that accelerated cultural development at a rate that biology alone cannot explain. The people did not change. Their genome remained stable. But their knowledge, their organizational capacity, and their technological sophistication transformed in what appears from the archaeological record to be a remarkably compressed time frame. And buried in that transformation is a detail that almost never makes it into the standard discussion. A detail that changes how we have to think about what the Sumerians actually were and what might have influenced their sudden leap forward. The detail appears in cylinder seals, small carved stones used to make impressions in wet clay, functioning as signatures and official marks in administrative documents. Thousands of these survived, preserved in the dry soil of Iraq, catalogued in museums across the world. Most show predictable imagery: kings in ritual poses, gods receiving offerings, agricultural scenes, standard iconography of Bronze Age bureaucracy. Then there are the others, a subset of cylinder seals dating primarily to the Uruk period around 3500 to 3100 BCE, depict something that does not fit the conventional narrative of gradual civilizational development. They show complex astronomical scenes, not simple representations of the sun and moon, detailed celestial mechanics, multiple planetary bodies arranged in configurations that suggest knowledge of orbital relationships. In some cases, the seals depict what appear to be star maps with accuracy that should not have been possible without instruments that would not exist for thousands of years. One seal in particular, catalogued in the Berlin Museum, shows a central star surrounded by 11 smaller spheres in what researchers initially dismissed as decorative patterning. Except the arrangement is not decorative. When analysed geometrically, the positioning of those spheres corresponds with unsettling precision to the relative positions of bodies in our solar system, including outer planets not visible to the naked eye, planets that would not be officially discovered until the invention of the telescope. How did a civilization with no documented optical technology produce imagery that requires optical technology to verify? The standard explanation is that the imagery is symbolic rather than literal. The Sumerians were depicting mythological cosmology, not actual astronomy. The resemblance to real planetary configurations is coincidental pattern matching by modern observers projecting contemporary knowledge onto ancient art. That explanation worked reasonably well until researchers started cross-referencing the cylinder seal imagery with Sumerian mathematical texts. The Sumerians used a base 60 counting system, sexagesimal mathematics, the same system we still use today for measuring time and angles: 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. That choice was not arbitrary. Base 60 allows for more divisors than base 10, making complex calculations involving fractions significantly easier without requiring decimal notation. It is, from a purely mathematical standpoint, a more sophisticated choice than the decimal system most of the world eventually adopted. Base 60 requires a level of abstract mathematical reasoning that should emerge gradually through centuries of practical calculation. Trial and error, incremental refinement. The Sumerians appear in the record already using it fully formed. No evidence of a transitional period where simpler systems were being tested and abandoned. They started with the sophisticated version. Then there is the question of what they were calculating. Cuneiform tablets from the Old Babylonian period, roughly 2000 to 1600 BCE, contain mathematical problems that are not simple accounting exercises. They show evidence of understanding the Pythagorean theorem more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They contain algorithmic approaches to solving quadratic equations. They demonstrate knowledge of mathematical constants that would not be formally described in Western mathematics until the Renaissance. One tablet, known as Plimpton 322, contains what appears to be a trigonometric table, not a basic one, a sophisticated reference tool for calculating angles and constructing right triangles with precision. It predates Greek mathematics by over a millennium, and it was found not in a temple or royal archive, but in what appeared to be an educational context, suggesting this was not elite secret knowledge. This was curriculum. What were they teaching? And more pressingly, what were they using it for? Agricultural societies need basic arithmetic, crop yields, land measurement, tax collection. They do not need trigonometry. They do not need algorithms for solving abstract mathematical problems with no immediate practical application. Unless the practical application existed and we simply have not identified what it was. The architectural evidence adds another dimension. Ziggurats were not simple platforms. They were precisely oriented structures aligned to cardinal directions and celestial events, with accuracy that required sophisticated surveying techniques and astronomical observation. The Great Ziggurat of Ur, even in its ruined state, shows construction tolerances that would be impressive in modern engineering. The corners align to true north within fractions of a degree. The proportions follow mathematical ratios that appear repeatedly across Sumerian monumental architecture. That level of precision is not accidental. It requires knowledge, geometric knowledge, astronomical knowledge, and the organizational capacity to apply that knowledge consistently across multiple construction projects spanning generations. The question that never quite gets answered is where the knowledge came from in the first place. Because here is what the archaeological record actually shows. The Ubaid period has villages, pottery, early irrigation, no mathematics, no writing, no monumental architecture. Then the Uruk period begins, and within a few centuries you have all of it simultaneously, fully operational, already integrated into a functioning bureaucratic system that required those tools to exist in order to operate. Something happened in that gap, something that has not been explained. The standard explanation goes like this. Agriculture develops, populations grow, social complexity increases. Writing emerges as a practical tool to manage that complexity. Accounting first, then administration, then literature. A gradual evolution from tokens to pictographs to abstract symbols, representing sounds and concepts. That is how writing is supposed to develop. Slowly, organically, with visible precursors. Sumerian cuneiform does not follow that pattern. The earliest tablets are not primitive attempts. They are functional administrative documents, inventories, transactions, lists of goods organized by category with numerical notations already in place. The system is operational from the moment it appears. No apprenticeship period, no evidence of scribes learning through trial and error, just competence. And the script itself is peculiar in ways that do not get enough attention. Cuneiform is a wedge-based writing system pressed into clay using a reed stylus. The shapes are geometric, triangular impressions combined in specific configurations to represent words and syllables. It is not intuitive. It requires training. Lots of it. Scribal schools in later periods took years to produce competent writers, yet the earliest examples show no signs of a learning curve. The first generation of scribes wrote as well as the fifth. How does a society go from no writing system to institutional literacy in what appears to be a single generation? The gap is not just technological, it is conceptual. Writing is not just recording speech. It is abstracting language into visual symbols that can be decoded by someone who was not present when the message was created. That cognitive leap, the understanding that marks on clay can preserve and transmit information across time and space, is enormous. Most human societies never made it independently. The Sumerians made it and immediately started using it for complex bureaucratic purposes. Then there is the matter of what they chose to write down. Early tablets are not stories. They are not religious texts. They are accounting records, grain deliveries, labor assignments, tax receipts. That tells you something about priorities. The first use of writing in human history was not to preserve myths or honor gods. It was to manage resources, to track obligations, to create a permanent record of who owed what to whom. That is the mindset of an organized state, not a tribal society experimenting with new technology. The library at Nippur offers another angle. Nippur was one of the great Sumerian cities, and its temple complex contained what might be the oldest library in the world. Thousands of tablets, catalogued, organized by subject, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, literature, religious texts. The scope is staggering, and the care taken in preservation suggests that knowledge was not just valued, but actively curated. This was not a random collection. This was an institution. Some of the mathematical tablets from Nippur contain problems that have no obvious practical application. Abstract exercises, theoretical calculations, the kind of work you do not pursue unless you have time, resources, and a culture that values intellectual activity for its own sake. Agricultural societies operating at subsistence levels do not produce recreational mathematics. They produce tools for immediate survival. The Sumerians were doing both simultaneously from the beginning. The astronomical texts are equally troubling. Sumerian astronomers tracked planetary movements with precision that required generations of continuous observation. They identified the 5 visible planets. They calculated lunar cycles. They understood the relationship between celestial events and seasonal changes well enough to create a functional calendar. That level of astronomical knowledge is not acquired quickly. It requires institutional memory, observatories, record-keeping systems, trained observers passing knowledge to apprentices over decades. Yet the earlier Sumerian astronomical records show sophistication that implies the observation program was already well established before the records themselves were created. What was happening during the Ubaid period that made all of this possible? Because the standard timeline does not provide enough time for the necessary development. You cannot go from village-level social organization to state-level bureaucracy without intermediate steps. You cannot develop writing, mathematics, astronomy, law, and monumental architecture simultaneously unless the groundwork was already in place. Something was happening that we are not seeing in the archaeological record. Or something was transmitted that left no physical trace until it was already fully operational. The Sumerian King List offers one final piece of the puzzle. It is a document that records the succession of kingship in Sumer from the beginning of civilization. Before the flood, it claims, kingship was held by rulers who reigned for thousands of years. After the flood, the reigns become realistic, human-length lifespans. The transition is abrupt. The pre-flood section reads like mythology. The post-flood section reads like history. What changed at that boundary? Why does the King List treat the flood as the moment when human civilization became fully human? And what does it mean that every foundational technology, writing, mathematics, law, appears in the post-flood period, already complete? The knowledge came from somewhere. The question is where? And why does the record go silent on the answer? The DNA confirmed what the archaeology kept suggesting, but never quite proved. The Sumerians were not travelers carrying knowledge from somewhere else. They were indigenous to Mesopotamia, genetically continuous with populations that had occupied the same land for thousands of years before cities existed. The transformation was not biological. It was not the result of migration or conquest. It was something else entirely. A population that had been there all along suddenly reorganized itself with a sophistication that required knowledge we cannot account for. The cylinder seals showing planetary configurations, the base 60 mathematics appearing fully formed, the astronomical precision embedded in architecture, the institutional literacy operating from day one. All of it points toward transmission rather than gradual development. Something was taught, something was given, and the record of how that happened exists only in the texts themselves, written in a language with no relatives, by a people who never moved, describing gods who came from the sky and established the order of civilization. The genetic evidence does not solve the mystery, it eliminates the easy answer and forces the harder question. If they were always there, what changed them? The answer might be sitting in untranslated tablets, or sealed beneath unexcavated tells, or encoded in astronomical records we have not learned to read correctly. What we know for certain is that the story we were told about the Sumerians being migrants who brought civilization with them is wrong. They were there first, and something found them.